The day was May the 12th, 2251. Thick haze and loose clouds loomed in the sky above the nuked, sparse remains of a dense urban center, muffling the evening sun's radiance. A subtle warm breeze howled in and around the bones of opulent homes, stacked apartment pods and flats, and leaning metal power pylons. Heavily damaged high and mid-rise buildings that once belonged to an office park sat along the east side of a partially collapsed, double-decker freeway. The office park once featured a cornucopia of modern innovations to accommodate the ever-increasing demands of tomorrow. Broken sections of parking lots for flying vehicles sat atop the crumbling towers. Built over this district was an expansive and segmented shopping mall of stilted saucers and pods, connected with shiny bridges. The shopping area even had direct access to the freeway. This wonder of the space age seemed to defy gravity. It had mostly since collapsed, if not from the bombs, from nearly 2 centuries of weather and decay. The structures on the closest side to the major urban center were in critical condition, if not completely collapsed, then missing their outer facades with their floors pancaked inwards. Segments of their steel skeletons remained, bent and twisted. Only parts of the structures on the farthest side from the city's downtown were recognizable by any measure. Inside one of these derelict but relatively intact office mid-rises there scavenged a gritty 17-year-old boy named Samuel Turner, with safety goggles on his forehead, a satchel over his shoulder, and a lever-action rifle on his back. He crept carefully through a debris-filled hallway, illuminated solely by the ambient light from the broken windows. At the end of the dark corridor he cupped his scruffy fingers around a sliding door latch, but it wouldn't budge. So he used his body weight to force it open. On the other side of the sliding door was a large room, illuminated quite well by several extended circular windows. It was once a corporate meeting room, with a long table in the middle and a master desk with a bulky computer terminal and an easy emblem on the top center. It had robotic arms that could easily sort through papers and files. By the time that Samuel came to the room, it was entirely ransacked, chairs thrown about, notebooks and folders littered around, and the ceiling partially collapsed. None of this rubble interested Samuel, however. He was searching for fusion cores. These were essentially small portable fusion batteries. Usually he'd find them in cars, easy appliances, or generators. But these ones were, more often than not, mostly used. Finding a fresh one was a rare occurrence. After inspecting the space for a minute, he approached the large high-tech desk at the other end of the room. If the other desks in the building were anything to reference, then it probably had a fusion core. So he clumsily nestled around the desk to see if it had one. In doing so, he accidentally knocked a radio off the shelf. When it hit the ground, the ink spots, if I didn't care, flickered on, with an uncomfortably high volume. Samuel was spooked, and tripped, knocking down even more stuff from the desk. Books, manuals, markers and pens, paper clips, magazines, and even a mug all tumbled to the hard floor. One newspaper, the Lone Star Gazette, still had legible text. Its headline read, "Chinese spies caught at West Tech Research Facility in California." Dated Wednesday, October 20th, 2077. 3 days before the bombs fell. With an unsettled slight panic, Samuel got off the ground and reached for the radio to turn it off. But the dials and buttons had been smashed in when the radio fell. Frustrated and annoyed, he quickly put the radio down and refocused on the desk. He ejected its fusion core and then slid it into the satchel, along with the other 2 cores that he salvaged from other rooms. The ink spots continued crooning loudly. "If I didn't care, would I feel this way? Would my every prayer begin and end with just your name? And would I be sure that this is love beyond compare? Would all this be true if I didn't care for you?" So Samuel made a hasty exodus, out the same door he'd entered through, but the radio sang on all the same, echoing eerily through the halls as he rushed out. Eventually he came to a lobby of sorts, with several thin circular elevator shafts along the exterior of the building. He peeked into one of the shafts to plan his route down. He was 8 stories up. Each glass-encased shaft consisted of 3 vertical beams and was bound by a horizontal ring every 8 feet or so. That was before the Great War. In 2251, there was no such glass, only the steel beams remained, so he stepped out carefully and hugged one of the beams. Once he had a good grip, he slid down to the next horizontal ring, as if the beam were a fireman's pole. He then prepared to do it again to get down to the next ring, and so on and so on. Unfortunately for Samuel, the only staircases in the structure had been crushed when the next door building collapsed. Eventually, he reached the bottom of the shaft and found himself in the building's dim vestibule, strewn with ceiling debris, decay, and even a blast-tossed car. The words, Bank of Texarkana, at Preston Park, were displayed prominently above the main entrance. He was unable to exit through it, however, as the exterior was piled too high with debris from the surrounding and elevated structures. So he headed for the parking garage, whence he entered. He followed a wide hallway in that direction, barely able to make out anything in its darkness. The paneled metal walls were lined with equidistant, polished aluminum columns. Shards from shattered chandeliers crunched under Samuel's feet, as he walked towards a dim light at the other end of the hallway. It was a revolving door. The only glass that remained in it was spiderwebbed. The frame scratched along the floor as Samuel pushed his way through it. On the other side was the ground level of the parking garage. The walls and ceiling were thick concrete, which had protected the ground level parking lot from the elements. Dozens and dozens of chrome-accented tail-fin vehicles filled the parking spaces and the driveways between them. Some even wrecked into each other, as if their drivers had attempted a panicked and untimely escape. The ones still parked in their spaces seemed to show off their finned trunks and lights like there was some sort of competition between them as he passed by. The front ends seemed to watch him, with their dusty, protruding headlights. The cars came in a variety of lovely colors, light blue and yellow, hot red and pink, mint and dark green, and black and white. The shelter afforded to the vehicles by the garage ceiling ensured that their colors remained somewhat pristine. But even this wasn't enough to keep dust and grime from collecting over time, muting their elegance and shine. After maneuvering through the wrecks, he came to the garage's vehicle entry point, which connected to a side road narrowly flanked by another large building, and piled high under chunks of concrete, steel beams, twisted rebar, and large metal plates. The entry to the garage was exposed just enough that he could get through without having to crawl. After climbing outside over some of the rubble, he stood, with one leg elevated onto the roof of a partially buried car. The outside was warm, and the sky was tawny, but the structural remains that surrounded him shaded him from the aggressive evening sun. Samuel had a broad but rough complexion, partially hidden by a long, drippy poncho that danced in the breeze. This poncho draped over his shoulders, concealed his brisk arms, and a lanky, ripped t-shirt. Worn out and loose jeans covered his scarred legs, and thick-soled boots protected his feet from the harsh and irradiated terrain. Underneath all the dirt and gruff, he was a tan boy, with dark, unruly hair and eyes of silver. Hygiene wasn't a concept he was familiar with. He had never seen a dentist, nor had he bathed in a recent memory. After scouting the area for a moment, he pulled his protection goggles over his eyes and proceeded carefully over the slopes of debris that lay between the building ruins. He stopped at an intersection where a road nameplate read, West Northwest Highway, and pulled a shiny canteen from his satchel. After popping its cap and inspecting what was inside, he took a sip. He then took a moment to spy out the crowded landscape and began a westbound trek down the thoroughfare. The Texarkana Bank building and others along the highway had more or less buffered it from being buried by the collapsing structures behind. Nevertheless, it was a chaotic mess that painted a tragic picture of the area's final moments as a functioning part of a city. Samuel stepped over the most resilient forms of human remains, partially exposed above the sediment. While stepping over a bunched family of these remains, he tripped. After rubbing his knees and elbows off a bit, he looked back at what caused him to stumble. It was a skull that had been unable to support his weight, and so caved in. The skull was relatively small compared to the others. He quickly disregarded it and got up to continue. Samuel was greatly desensitized to all the uncensored death that surrounded him. Stepping over human bones was a normal part of life, a minor inconvenience of scavenging and travel, like a hiker stepping over stones on a rocky trail. Along with the skeletons were rusting cars. Unlike the vehicles under the parking garage, these were directly exposed to the sun and the harsh weather, from the nuclear winter of the late 21st century to the scorching heat waves of the rebounding sun. Any windows or paint had disappeared long, long ago, leaving only a brown husk with rotted tires. Weathered newspaper stands, covered telephone booths, bus stops, benches, and trash cans also decorated the sidewalks and plazas. From the farthest corner of his peripheral vision, a very subtle motion upon one of the building facades grabbed his attention. His eye was rather perceptive. He immediately jerked into a defensive position, discreetly pulling his rifle off his back, and holding it in the direction of the movement. A five-eyed, six-legged lizard clung to the wall. It was nearly 7 feet long. It had a very bony spine that poked through its scales. Once Samuel's initial shock wore off, he relaxed. The mutated reptile scurried up the wall and into a window cavity. So he resumed his westbound journey, which brought him shortly to an overpass that intersected with his path. There hung another faded green sign from a stoplight that read, North Texas Turnpike. The underside of the bridge was again a mess of ornate family sedans and coupes, sleek fire engines and semi-trucks. Even the service vehicles were decorated relics of pre-war optimism and mobility, though they had long been stripped of their most valuable parts and loot, and their doors were either missing or wide open, with raggedly dressed skeletons in and around them. Some of their chrome trim and hood ornaments glistened in the sunlight. At the overpass, Samuel's course turned left, following the turnpike southward into the city. Both the north and southbound sides had their own frontage roads for ease of traffic access. Samuel used the southbound lanes to follow the sunken freeway, eventually merging onto it. Traveling along the North Texas Turnpike was a chore of its own, since the upper level had collapsed onto the lower level in many areas. With his poncho blowing unruly in the breeze, he continued south, hiking over the leveled freeway as if it were a jagged mountain range. In between and inside the mashed vehicular shells were the skeletal remains of even more people. The path along the freeway was a bed of jagged and broken rib cages, skulls, femurs, and everything in between. It was a gravesite for those unfortunate enough to have been caught in traffic when the early and only warning came. Most of them abandoned their cars in an effort to find somewhere safer to hide, forming terrified stampedes, only wanting to escape certain death. The scattered bones testified to their ultimate failure in the race against the impending doom. Determined xerophytic plants that had mutated and adapted to the harsh post-war climate grew around the bones and steel. Traversing the wastes was an arduous task. Nevertheless, Samuel kept his eyes and ears open and alert to his surroundings, ready to spot or hear even the slightest disturbance. But aside from the ambient breeze, there was nothing. The wasteland was bleak and quiet. The turnpike was surrounded on either side by rows upon rows of blasted townhomes, single-family homes, and dense apartment flats. It was as if the freeway had cut right through the dense residential environment. Sets of lights that once illuminated the freeway leaned in all directions, mostly away from the city. A slanted, faded billboard grew out of the haze as Samuel approached the highway exit for Lover's Lane. "Don't let the nuclear holocaust catch you off guard. Reserve a spot in Vault 50 today," it yelled silently into the desolation. This text was accompanied by a cheeky, blue-clad and yellow-haired cartoon boy who winked out and gave a thumbs up, as if he guaranteed security to the passers-by. An illustration of an all-American nuclear family seemed to confirm the message with confident smiles as they were in line for entrance into Vault 50. Most other billboards had completely lost their paint and prints over a century ago, rendering them illegible. But this Vault-Tec advert was bent in such a way so that it was protected from most weather and sunlight. But Samuel had never learned to read, so he was indifferent. He wouldn't have known what it meant or what it was for anyway. To him, it was just another remnant of a world long gone, and not a world he had been blessed to know. He had heard rumors about a major corporation from the old world known as Vault-Tec. They were the ones responsible for this billboard and their advertised state-of-the-art fallout-proof, sprawling bunkers. Their blue-suited, yellow-haired mascot was among the most iconic relics in the wasteland. Stumbling across some facet of this corporation was a rather common occurrence while scavenging. Despite this, Samuel was skeptical of the idea that there existed somewhere deep beneath the ground troves of pre-war American life. The assumption therein seemed to be completely unfounded. Pre-war life in general was not something he could really comprehend anyway, and whether or not they existed out there somewhere utterly detached from the modern state of the world had no bearing on his life, so he didn't really concern himself with too much curiosity or speculation. Samuel proceeded down the exit lane, which was lined right up next to the highway, as it gradually climbed to an intersection up ahead at West Lover's Lane. The frontage road was nestled very comfortably between the old freeway, with the tall retaining wall that once sheltered posh homes from the sound of traffic. This wall had long been flattened, however, revealing the residential ruins. An automated toll booth served as a portal from the exit road to the densely packed commercial hub that was Lover's Lane. The approaching traffic lights and gadgets were bent away from the inner city. One light pole was completely smashed underneath a trash truck that had been dragged by the shockwave. Much like the previous intersection, this one was also a mess of rusting away wrecks and bones. Most intersections were like that. Maneuvering around the toppled trash truck, Samuel started westward down Lover's Lane, as the sun descended further into evening. Lover's Lane was lined up and down with partially leveled strip malls, along with thin parking lots and garages that were crammed right up to the street, crowded with shuffled and tossed automobiles. These shopping strips were among the many modernized amenities that resulted from the fusion revolution that swept across America's cities in the 2060s and 70s. The prominent architectural style from the time earned the nickname atomist, characterized by smooth round edges and ellipses. In denser established areas, such as Lover's Lane, it was most often retrofitted onto existing infrastructure and buildings. Otherwise, outdated buildings and city blocks were demolished so as to make room for a great big beautiful tomorrow. Large pods in different faded colors of neon were also stacked on top of already existing buildings, or even roads in some cases, with street access via spiral staircases that wrapped around a central elevator shaft. These were called easy pods. Their versatility allowed them to be placed almost anywhere and even stacked on top of each other, so long as an elevator and staircase shaft could be installed beneath. These became popular in the 2050s as a symbol of economic efficiency during the resource wars due to their low need for materials, and were even viewed as a viable option for outer space colonization. With a special drone carrier, some of these pods themselves could also be transported to any desired location with an easy pod base. They were portable and affordable. They came in a variety of sizes and were fully customizable, to function as shops or even homes. Those along Lover's Lane, stacked upon the strip malls, were just more shopping outlets for the dense and hungry customer base of Highland and University Park. Prior to the war, Lover's Lane was known for its excessive density and signage. Most of these structures, whether strip malls or pods, used to house all sorts of businesses. Beauty salons, banks, high-end Tex-Mex and steak joints, and more. There were also a few detached diners, Starcrust Pizzeria, Saucer Jack's, Fat Boy, and Golden Waffle, angsty and bold in their appearances. Saucer Jack's, for instance, famous for its stuffed pancakes, was built to look something like a stack of streamlined pancakes, or flapjacks, if it was a flying saucer. Their respective street signs were just as daring as the buildings themselves, with confident shapes and arrows competing to direct hungry motorists and pedestrians into their dining rooms and drive-thrus. Their post-war appearances were less stunning, however. Their signs of Googie had an inclination away from the city, and all of their plastic had melted like candle wax from the nuclear firestorm, and then dried and hung like icicles. Directly above the center of Lover's Lane was a monorail suspended from arches on the left-hand side of the road. Directly in front of the Saucer Jacks was a collapsed station, and several rail cars that had collapsed with it, onto the road. The cars had a straightforward, streamlined design with an arrow and the word DART, which was an acronym for Dallas Area Rapid Transit. Next up along his trek, he passed more leveled strip malls and a cinema. Though its marquee was heavily damaged and tilting, it stood resiliently. It featured the name of the theater, in a bold cursive font, Lover's Lane Plaza Theater. And just below it, now showing The Man from Dead Horse, featuring America's favorite cowboy, Cooper Howard. Only a handful of commercial easy pods remained elevated above the strip mall. Most of them had been knocked over into the parking lot, crushing the vehicles and ruins beneath. At the southeastern corner of Inwood Road and West Lovers Lane was a dense shopping center, with an astroporium as its centerpiece. Before it was leveled, its large structural footprint and parking lot took up an entire block. The roads were a never-ending bed of treachery, buried under fragments of metal, telephone poles, and concrete from nearby buildings that had been blasted from the shockwave, and also tons of vehicles and street-side amenities like light poles, benches, and bus stops. Human bones were also scattered everywhere, almost as if the dusty sky had sprinkled them down. Ever since Samuel was a little boy, he had explored the ins and outs of these ruins. From the monorail to Saucer Jacks to the stacked and toppled pods, it was his playground. He had a rather intimate awareness and knowledge of the ruins, of their secrets and hazards, though they had been stripped of anything valuable long before Samuel came around. Up ahead, in a derelict parking lot, there was an antlered buck silently watching Samuel approach. By the time he noticed it, it was too late, and barely caught the four-eared buck prancing daintily away into the ruins. "Tame Herbert!" he exclaimed angrily in disappointment. Translated into pre-war English, this would be "damn horned buck." Ever-evolving grammar and dialect standards across the wastes were slowly but surely creating new and distinct languages. The next several blocks of buildings were exclusively modern, at least in relation to the previous blocks. He also passed a multi-story high school, a block of collapsing mid-rise apartment buildings and other upscale flats, and a large parking lot that belonged to a Fusion car dealership, nestled comfortably at the southeastern corner of the West Lovers Lane and Lemon Avenue intersection. West Lovers Lane curved into the intersection and terminated there. Samuel kept on straight. The other side of the intersection was a complete mess of ruins, partially collapsed office and commercial buildings, and more easy pods spilling into the surrounding lots and beyond. He proceeded over a twisted metal beam, through the broken side of a lopsided pod. and climbed over debris and piles of furniture to get through a circular window on the other side. There was a 5-foot gap between the window of the pod and the roof of a mostly buried van below. Samuel jumped down and then crawled through a concentrated pile of windowless, bent vehicle frames and broken bubble-topped hover cars that had been blown off of the rooftop parking lot before it collapsed, forming a sort of ramp. The outer facade of the structure itself was very bunker-like, a product of gentrification during the height of the Fusion Revolution and Red Scare. The thick, smooth concrete walls were recessed at each floor by thin wraparound slits. They were gunport-like windows. Its exterior resilience was a testament to pre-war construction technology, though most of the interior had collapsed in on itself. In order to access one of these window slits, which was 2 stories above the rubble, he had to climb up a collapsed Big Tex plutonium well. These were fission reactors, usually affixed onto the sides of larger buildings, that used a dredger to get materials deep beneath the ground for fuel. This one had fallen off of its supporting structure, so Samuel could climb it. He squeezed into one of the windows, with the rifle on his back, and then crawled over tufts of fiberglass, drywall that had been reduced to powder, and even some human bones in the space between a wall and the exterior shell that kept it from falling completely over. Eventually, he was able to slip back outside through a crevice between 2 of the pancaked floors. Despite his familiarity with this route, he exercised maximal caution to avoid the twisted, rusted waffles of rebar that protruded in every direction from chunks of concrete and debris. Slowly he meandered his way down the rubble. Poking through the concrete were some remnants of a chain-link fence. Hanging loosely from it was a faded sign that read, Dallas Love Field Regional Airport, Restricted Area. Yet Samuel continued right past it without the slightest care. He was entirely unfamiliar with the idea of off-limits. His only boundary was lack of curiosity, or the knowledge of danger. In the old world, society was organized and governed by various laws and codes of conduct and ethics. If you violated such standards, then you were punished by some level of civil authority and could receive any sort of sentence, depending on the crime and degree of violation. In the New World, things were much more simple. Consequences were only imposed by nature. Some harshly discovered the imposing laws of gravity, or that mountain lions are only soft and warm when they're asleep. Samuel had his wits about him, though, and he didn't have a death wish, so he kept his head, even if just barely. A large structure sat on the other side of the restricted area. This one was a roofless, mostly destroyed hangar. Samuel hiked over the blasted walls and right into the muffled sunlight, which had formerly been obstructed by the hangar's last standing wall. A massive, wide-open expanse lay there before him. It was Dallas Love Field Regional Airport. Lazy rays of sunlight fell through the skimpy clouds, gently illuminating the airfield. It was like a vast lake, with hangars and warehouses jutting out into it from the side, like boat docks. The only thing to interrupt the airfield's flat consistency was the occasional plane, or chunk of debris that had been blown in from outside the airport. On the horizon at the very opposite end of the field, almost directly across from Samuel, stood a lone, steep triangular air traffic control tower. It was by far the tallest thing in the area, and it served as a significant landmark due to its high visibility. After briefly spying out the field, Samuel resumed his trek towards the tower. The flatness of the airport was much like a desert or plain, compared to the rest of Dallas, covered in dense urban remnants. Before the Great War, the entire airfield had been paved with thick concrete, but centuries of decay and a lack of maintenance left it severely cracked. And years of sand, dust, and dirt collection made certain spots prime for overgrowth. Thick brush and thistle, and even some cacti sprouted in these areas, as nature slowly reclaimed the earth. A dozen or so jetliners littered the airfield and had left scars in the tarmac after being dragged by the shockwave. A few plowed into the ground as if they had been knocked just out of the air. The planes themselves were colossal, almost triple the size of a traditional airliner. They were iconic for blending their wings into the fuselage, and for primarily housing passengers within their massive wings. Each wing had a cluster of 4 atomic engines. As Samuel approached the airport, the concourse grew into a recognizable shape. Dozens of defunct planes added long, extended jetways under the watchful presence of the tower. It was the terminal. On the southern side, just left of the terminal, relative to his peripheral vision, there was a multi-level parking garage. The airport terminal and tower seemed to be the only set of buildings in the area that were still almost completely standing, with a very few exceptions. Among the plane wrecks and scattered debris were some post-war fortifications and structures, made mostly of airplane scrap, but also some commercial sign boxes, car doors, repurposed chain-link fences, barbed wire, and everything in between. Over time, some sand had piled up on those walls facing west, A few windmills also dotted the landscape, made from mostly jet engine turbines. Samuel's path led him just between the large terminal and parking garage, towards the airport security and robot maintenance office. The area was secured by another post-war fortification, which stretched from the terminal to the garage. The wall was reinforced with airport police cars, airplane wings, and other general airport ruins. The top of the wall was lined with hazardous debris like sharp metal rebar spikes or glass shards. There was only one discreet way in. Samuel had to squeeze through the glassless window frame of a police car, and then come out the other side into the small space between it and the rest of the wall. Behind the police car there was a dented panel that opened up to a security booth, which to Samuel was just a hazardless way through. A cramped alleyway was on the other side, with the parking garage on the left and the airport security admin building on the right. Beyond the admin building, the alley opened up into a sort of courtyard, walled in by the airport structure and parking garage. The courtyard seemed to once be a parking area for maintenance and staff, as there were rows of decaying automobiles. The concourse itself was about 3 stories, each level hanging just over the level below. A slanted cantilevered roof hung from the very top, which cast a deep shadow over the yard. Samuel headed for a small doorless entrance below the second story's overhang. The inside was completely pitch black. Despite this, Samuel was deeply familiar with the room's layout. He maneuvered around the invisible obstacles and debris that covered the floor, and found a scuffed-up door on the other end of the room. He used his body weight to push it open, which brought him at last into the airport's check-in. The only light source was the setting sun, peeping in through the front walls and windows. Broken glass glistened in reflection, but for the most part the still existing structure did a good job at keeping the natural light away. The floor, covered in structural debris, was like an old pancake spread over with too much chunky peanut butter. The grand lobby, flanked by gift shops and Love Landing, was in utter disarray, with open bags and looted suitcases piled about and strewn across the floor. A recruitment poster on a military booth read, "Lend a hand to Uncle Sam in Anchorage, and list today." There was a high concentration of human skeletons scattered around as well. A few even hung from the ceiling, some missing limbs. These were the remains of those immediate survivors, partially sheltered by the airport. Instead of immediately dying, many of them found themselves blinded and on fire. Surviving was not, after all, the fortune that many considered it was beforehand. There arose among them an urgent and universal demand for medical attention, but that demand was never met. Samuel also passed a few dead security robots known as protectrons among the piles. They had 2 wonky legs, bigger at the foot than the knees and thighs, each connected to the boxy main body at a ball joint. Same with the arms. The protectrons were built with metal plates around the upper body portion, and with no necks. Their heads protruded out of the shoulders. Its face was a large glass window, barred on the inside to protect its sensors. These were produced by Robco Industries. Prior to the Great War, there were many companies that specialized in producing residential, commercial, and industrial robots. They were a main staple in American life. As Samuel got farther into the airport, the concourse became dark and filled with shadows. It wasn't long before Samuel couldn't see anything at all, but he didn't need to. He knew the airport grounds like the back of his hand. He eventually arrived at a wall with an air vent near the floor, only visible because some thin shreds of light seeped through the other end of the duct. Discreetly, he bent down onto his knees and set his lever-action rifle down. He then pulled the vent cover off carefully and struggled to fit into the duct. After grabbing the rifle and putting the vent's cover back on, he dragged himself through. At the other side, he used his free hand and the top of his head to knock the vent cover off the wall, exposing the light source that had slipped through the vents. A large window frame on the opposite wall allowed the evening sky to subtly illuminate the room. An exterior breeze also whistled in through the glassless frame. Samuel crawled into the room and set his rifle next to the tunnel, and then placed the vent back on the wall. On Samuel's left-hand side there was a door, sealed with boards and chains. On the right-hand side was a water purifier and several large military-grade collection barrels, and half a dozen metal buckets. In the middle of the room was a very worn and ripped couch, which functioned as a bed. Unfolded quilts of worn rags and clothing were piled all over it. In front of the couch was a small table and an easy televox perched on a rusty metal support. Its cracked screen was missing several shards of glass. Samuel was ignorant of its original purpose. He used it as a stand for his armor of ripped tire fragments and license plates, mostly from the Texarkana Commonwealth, but also one from Oklahoma of the Plains Commonwealth. Above this was an analog clock, stuck at 8:57. Every surface was cluttered with years' worth of spoils and treasure. Hubcaps, bobbleheads, trophies, keychains, toys, sports gear, and some electrical components that seemed interesting. Though his favorite, a bobblehead of Jim Kowalski, who was a player for the National Baseball League's Dallas Mockingbirds, was displayed in the most prominent spot. He didn't know a thing about baseball, but he found much delight in patting its head. On the right side of the room was the entrance to an out-of-order elevator, and a staircase that spiraled around it. Next to this was a small, portable fusion generator. Several patchy cords of different dirty shades of yellow and orange poured out of it, and led all over the room, and even up the stairs. Samuel swapped the generator's dead fusion core with the one he'd obtained earlier. Suddenly, with a skippy buzzing noise, a trail of Christmas lights dangling from the ceiling flickered on. This provided some much-appreciated light to the dim room. It was quaint and untidy, but it was his home, the only one he'd ever known. He knew it as Turfey, which was the natural evolution of the name Turner Field, which the Turners had given the place when they settled it. Samuel's ancestors found these ruins in the late 22nd century. They were originally from a place called Midland, Texas. Prior to the Great War, Midland's role in the economy was rather insignificant, after oil wells reportedly ran dry in the 2050s. Much of its population fled to rapidly expanding urban centers like Denver, Houston, or Dallas. So when Judgment Day came to America, it was not a high-priority target for the Red Menace. As a result, it was spared a direct nuclear strike, so the Turner family who resided there survived. With the rest of Midland, they formed a small republic that thrived mostly on bartering until the 2150s, when it devolved into several prominent family factions fighting over the last working vehicle. By that time, the population had severely dwindled. In the 2170s, desertification brought relentless sandstorms from the west that slowly began burying the abandoned city. It became apparent that survival there was going to be impossible. The fallout of man's destructive nature had far-reaching consequences for the earth and its climate. So the Turner clan migrated east along I-20 until they landed in the ruins of Love Field. They erected the fortifications, walls, and windmills that sat on the airfield. They used the airfields to farm, wherever they could, and cultivated a habitable and somewhat comfortable home out of the place. At least about as comfortable as an airport on the brunt of a nuclear attack could be, a century after the fact. One relic of comfort was a Watts stereo console on the exterior wall beneath the window. It had several compartments for storage and an insert slot for laser-readable storage devices called holotapes. These could store anything from movies to games to music to home recordings and more. Samuel only had one holotape, and it was a music compilation album. His imagination drifted over into a sad sort of nostalgia as he observed the stereo. He and his dad used to fall asleep to the music stored on the holotape. Why, they used to play it while doing anything nearby. They were very fond memories that sorely reminded him of his dad, whom he had not seen in many years after he disappeared hunting. Life without him was incredibly lonely. The only companion Samuel had since was the wilderness, who was often silent, except for when it carried the echoes of the wind or his own voice. With a solemn face, he slowly pressed the play button. 3 vacuum tubes tucked in the back of the stereo turned on dramatically, and then began the Andrews sisters' Daddy. Hey, listen to my story about a gal named Daisy May. Lazy Daisy May. Her disposition is rather sweet and charming, at times alarming, so they say. Samuel then opened one of the compartments in the console and exposed a few food items. He grabbed a can that said Big Tex Chili, and then closed the cupboard. Pre-war food was usually a treat whenever Samuel could find it. During the height of the resource wars, the U.S. government commissioned several food suppliers to engineer products that could remain safe for human consumption indefinitely. As a result, a lot of packaged foods were so chock full of preservatives that they were still edible and somewhat nutritious even 174 years later. Unfortunately, the taste in these foods was an element that had been lost to time, but it was all the same to Samuel, who had no reference point. Despite the barrenness of the nuclear wilderness he inhabited, there was a great abundance of game to be hunted. There wasn't a single part of Dallas that some nature hadn't overtaken. Mountain lions, coyotes, and deer often pranced across the airfield. Even big herds of 2-headed longhorns came through quite often and grazed upon the runways. So for the most part, he hunted for his food. Pre-war food was reserved for days when he was out exploring. With the can of chili in hand, he headed for the stairs. The holotape continued playing in the background. She has a man who's tall, dark, handsome, large, and strong, to whom she used to sing this song. Hey, Daddy, I want a diamond ring, bracelets, everything. Daddy, you ought to get the best from me. Hey, Daddy, gee, don't I look swell in sables, clothes with Paris labels? Daddy, you ought to get the best from me. Here's an amazing revelation, with a bit of stimulation. I'd be a great sensation. I'd be your inspiration. Daddy, I want a brand new car, champagne, caviar. Daddy, you ought to get the best from me. Samuel was rather captivated by the sisters' harmonious voices. Their singing style was enchanting. They weren't called America's sweethearts for nothing. Aside from the holotape, Samuel had never heard such soft, elegant voices. Why, he had never actually met a real human female, at least not one that he could remember. His mother, along with almost every other female relative, had been taken away by a group his dad called the Empire when he was very young. so he was entirely curious about everything that fell under the category of woman. Aside from pre-war illustrations that he came across, and recordings like Daddy, he was completely ignorant in anything pertaining to the female sex. His dad had told him that they were quite unlike anything else in the wasteland, and judging by what little he'd seen, he was inclined to agree. His primary ambition, aside from survival, was to meet a real woman, though he had no idea where he might find one. He had heard rumors of clans and tribes in the far north part of the Commonwealth, clans that were peaceful and even somewhat hospitable. But he was not one to risk his life for a mere rumor. Besides, given what happened to his own family, he was very skeptical of other people, and did his best to avoid them at all costs. The stairs spiraled up several times around the elevator shaft, climbing dozens of feet and eventually leading into the floor of the next story. The room atop was circular, and a singular panoramic window frame followed along its 360-degree curve. It was the air traffic control tower. Lots of clunky computer terminals, holographic projectors, and control pads, with way too many buttons, switches, and vacuum tubes remained there, functioning as shelving for Samuel. The central elevator shaft alone supported the ceiling, along with the decorative triangular wall on the outside that extruded from the tower's base. It had a prime view of the entire airport and beyond. Clusters of building stubs and steel frames stuck out of the dim horizons near and far, including those belonging to Preston Park, whence he came. According to Samuel's father, these expansive ruins once belonged to a bustling city known as Dallas. In combination with Fort Worth, it was home to around 20 million kinds of people called Texans. There were many cities like this in the country called America. America was made up of 13 commonwealths and 50 states. But one day there was a great war, which brought an end to America and all of its states, commonwealths, and cities, as bombs rained from the sky. The scant remnants of Garland, Plano, Addison, and Irving had some of the densest concentration of high and mid-rise remains, if they could be called that, but the chief among them was that of Dallas. The entire southeastern horizon was dominated by twisted towers of jagged steel from mostly Old East Dallas, uptown, and even a few in Oak Lawn and on the banks of the Trinity Riverbed. Downtown proper, being ground zero for a 3.5 megaton ground burst, was reduced to a large crater, though this was mostly obstructed by the leveled ruins between Love Field and Uptown. In any case, Samuel huddled down next to a cooking station in the middle of the tower's floor, where there was a stack of pots, pans, and other cooking utensils, crossed his legs, and turned on an old electric griddle, which was connected to the downstairs generator via an extension cord. Then he grabbed the knife from the mess of dishes beside the griddle and used it to open the can. The lid came off with a hiss and revealed a grimy sludge. Most pre-war Americans would have vomited at the mere sight of it, but Samuel didn't know any better. He never thought much of the fact that some of the food he ate was over 170 years old. He had almost no concept of sanitation, food safety, or expiration dates. According to his dad, heat killed germs anyway. After the stove had warmed up, he ripped the can's label off, placed it on the stove's grate, and watched. He shifted his knees up, set his arms on top, and then rested his chin on them. The wind blowing through the tower's wraparound window produced a choir-like, though chaotic, harmony of gales. The still-playing holotape from down in the lounge cultivated a sad atmosphere, as the deep, dusk-filled sky casted shadows over the ruins of Dallas. After Daddy finished, the remaining holotape tracks played in this order. Earth Angel by the Penguins, I Got Texas in My Soul by Tex Williams, Sunshine, Lollipops, and Rainbows by Leslie Gore, Shotgun Boogie by Tennessee Ernie Ford, Stompin' Shaboom by the Dories, Pistol Packin' Mama by Bing Crosby and the Charioteers, King of the Road by Roger Miller, Love That Bomb by Dr. Strangelove and the Fallouts, Big D by Joe Stafford, Yes Tonight, Josephine by the Surrounders, and last but not least, Honeycomb by Jimmy Rogers. These 12 songs were the only songs that he could choose to listen to at any given time, and they were among the few that he had ever heard. So he knew them by heart, word for word. Despite this, he was mostly ignorant of their original meanings. He didn't even know what half of their vocabulary meant. So it was more a matter of mimicking the sounds that the holotape players spewed rather than singing along with them. He had some vague idea of what the songs were trying to convey, and he figured most of them were about love. Like when Leslie Gore sang, "Everything that's wonderful is what I feel when we're together." But some of them were about entirely separate topics, like Dallas, Fort Worth, San Angelo, Houston, Austin, or El Paso, which, according to Tex Williams, was where he had to go because apparently his soul was in those places. Other songs were about guns, like Ford's Shotgun Boogie, or Crosby's when he sang Pistol Packin' Mama, Lay That Pistol Down. The album was 2069 Radio Favorites, distributed by Radiant Records. His dad told him that Ray D.O. was the name of the pre-war radio station in Dallas known as Big D, hence the capitalized D in Ray D.O. These songs, as the holotape name implied, were indeed about the favorite things of pre-war Texans, that is, love, guns, and of course, Texas. Eventually, the canned sludge began to boil, and Samuel figured it was good enough to eat, so he used a pair of tongs to grab the heated can and dump the contents in an old platter. With that, the holotape also finished playing through its tracks, and then ambient silence filled its place. Another quiet, lonely dinner after another uneventful, lonely day. Each day that passed like this sucked more and more life out of him. The whispers and hums of the famished wind seemed to accentuate the feeling. In the old world, boys his age would have had a car, and probably a girlfriend to take to the movies, ice cream parlors, and diners. They would have danced and jived to the jukebox on Saturday night after a long week in school. And then they would have gone to church on Sunday morning, only to start the weekly cycle all over again as the dread of Monday set in. And yet, even still, the most mundane of weekly schedules were interrupted and surprised by periodic and timely breaks, where entire families would have taken vacations and traveled across Mother America to see her historical and national monuments, from the Redwood Forest to the Grand Canyon, at least before it lost its status as national park in 2057, to the Gulf Stream waters. All that to say, their lives were very full and exciting, teeming with all sorts of things to taste, see, and experience. Samuel had no concept of the magnitude of what he was missing out on. Every day he climbed through the ruins, but he didn't know their original purposes. He guessed pre-war life was busy and fast, but that was about it. The sun continued dipping deeper into the sky, as the haze and clouds flourished pink. Along with the sun went the warmth of the day, and coming was the nighttime chill. The Great War had a profound impact on global temperatures. Temperatures below 60 degrees Fahrenheit in May were unheard of in Dallas before the Great War. When the bombs came, the destruction wasn't limited to shockwaves. Intense heat from the bombs ignited fires that consumed everything. Any part of a city that wasn't wiped away by the immediate blast burned. Entire mountain ranges covered in dense forests, from the Cascades and Rockies to the Appalachians, Alleghenies, and Adirondacks, were all a raging blaze. Scorching flames engulfed the Great Plains and rolling hills of the Ozarks. These intense fires lasted for months, as the infrastructure and first responders that were previously in place to fight such disasters had been decimated. As a result, unimaginable amounts of smoke and ash filled the atmosphere, clouding the northern hemisphere and causing a bitter and unabating nuclear winter. This period lasted for about 30 years. By 2251, it had long since subsided, but the long-term consequences to the climate were catastrophic in scale and were still felt. Despite the extreme warmth of the daytime, which Texas was known for even before the Great War, nights commonly chilled to below 60 degrees as late as May or even as early as September. When he finished scraping the warm sludge from the dish, he set it aside and took a modest drink from his canteen. He then got up to close the place down. He went around the perimeter of the tower and closed all of its makeshift shutters. If he left them open, mutated June bugs, grasshoppers, and wasps would infest the place. After closing all the shutters, the only light left was that of the string lights, which extended into the room from downstairs, as well as the thin strips of light that grafted in through the cracks in between the shutters. He then headed back down the stairs, shut the old lounge's single window shutter, and turned the generator off. Darkness filled the room as the string lights dimmed off. With that, he took off his boots and crashed into the pile of quilts on the couch. His feet throbbed from all the walking he had done that day. He was thoroughly exhausted. His bed was quite comfortable, by post-war standards anyway. The couch he slept on was cushy, though it was torn in some spots. The quilts he used were made from t-shirts and jeans and undergarments and suits from the assorted airport luggage. The quilts themselves weren't very warm individually, but Samuel slept beneath a pile of them, so he stayed cozy, especially with the outside draft blocked by the shutter. The sound of the wind howling around the building and into its cracks provided a constant, relatively gentle sound to relax Samuel. So with that, he dozed off.